Yeah. So this is downtown Minneapolis, 1901. We kind of talked about this time period when cycling was transitioning from the wheelmen going out on sojourns to the lakes to early workers who were using bikes to get around. And this is really exactly that point in time when you start to see bikes not just used on side paths and on trails and in nature, but in the city for utility.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Active Towns channel. My name is John Simmerman, and that is Peter Bird joining us from Heidelberg, Germany. Peter is actually studying with the Technical University of Eindhoven, working on his PhD and doing studies around the historical nature of cycling cities. And that's what we are going to be nerding out about here today. But before we jump into that, I just want to say, if you're enjoying this content here on the Active Towns channel, please consider supporting my efforts by becoming an Active Towns ambassador. Super easy to do. Just navigate over to activetowns.org, click on the support tab at the top of the page. There's several different options, and every little bit really helps keep this going, keep this content coming to you. So please do what you can to help out. Okay, let's get right to it with Peter Bird. Mr. Peter Bird, thank you so much for joining me on the Active Towns podcast. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Peter, I love giving my guests just an opportunity to introduce themselves. So who the heck is Peter Bird?
Yeah. So I'll tell you, first of all, I'm actually joining from Heidelberg, Germany, where I live. I'm from the US originally, where I worked as a bicycle planner, transportation planner, in advocacy first in Denver, and then working for the planning department in Nashville, Tennessee. But I've been in Germany for the last 5 years. And I'm currently actually working for a Dutch university, for the Eindhoven University of Technology, where I am a PhD researcher and also the North American coordinator for the Cycling Cities project, which is a kind of historical research-oriented group that looks at histories of cycling cities around the world, trying to understand kind of why it happened in some places and didn't develop the same way in other ones, with the goal of using those historical pieces to guide bicycle planning, urban planning, policymaking today. So, joining from Heidelberg.
How fabulously and fantastically international.
Yeah.
That is fantastic. Well, tell a little bit about your journey. How the heck did you end up there, especially from, all these other locations here domestically in the United States?
Yeah. So I had an opportunity back in 2020 to do this transatlantic exchange program through the Robert Bosch Foundation. And so when I applied for it, it was before COVID happened or anyone really knew anything about it. But then I ended up coming to Germany right in the middle of COVID. So we had to travel with documents in English and French and German and try to see which countries we could actually transition through. Made our way to Germany, where we lived in Berlin for, I guess the program was for a year. And so I worked with a few German institutions, research institutions, ones that are focused on active mobility and bicycle planning, policy work. And then after the program finished, my family and I just decided to stay in Germany. So we slowly made our transition, spent 3 years in total in Berlin, and then we've been in Heidelberg for the last almost going on 2 years.
Fabulous. That is interesting. Did you, by chance, attend the Velocity in Leipzig a couple years ago?
I didn't, but while I was on my fellowship, I did actually work with Jill Wagner, who's I guess the title is the CEO for the European Cyclist Federation.
Oh,
and so I worked with her.
Jill Warren.
Warren,
Yeah.
Sorry. Yep. Jill Warren. So I interviewed her, worked a little bit during my projects. I'm well aware of that, but I haven't actually been able to visit it in person.
Yeah. I only mention that because I had to make my way to Berlin, and then from Berlin get on the train and head on over there, and then I went out of my way to do a bike ride from the new Berlin airport all the way into the city center. Boy, that was a wild ride.
Yeah. So I haven't done this, but I'm pretty sure that there's a dedicated kind of cycleway that goes between Berlin and Leipzig.
I didn't even notice that. Yeah. It's got to be a long one.
I haven't done it, but it's pretty, because by train, it's maybe an hour and a half.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what the actual distance is, but there's a dedicated kind of branded bike trail that goes between the two.
So I have to ask, how's your German?
It's good enough. I do most of my business in German, most of my day-to-day stuff. For my work is all English. At home it's all English. My wife's American also, but I can do all of my official meetings with the government and things I need to do in German. My supervisor at my university in the Netherlands is convinced, and not totally wrongly, but that between English and German I should be able to also understand Dutch. And so sometimes she gives me Dutch books, which I can navigate a table of contents and through Dutch, but that's about it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and as I understand it, if you're actually doing transportation related work in the Netherlands, it's pretty much all done in Dutch.
I think so. Yeah, yeah. I actually don't work at the transportation level very much in the Netherlands, but I think that is the case though. I think there are some companies who do international work where they kind of more clearly divide their domestic versus international. But yeah, yeah.
So I'm going to pull up the map here just because I'm like, Heidelberg, where's Heidelberg? So okay, all right. So let's kind of get our bearings here. We see that Heidelberg is boom right in here. We can kind of see some of the other countries. You've got Belgium off there to the west there. Interesting.
We are right on the eastern edge of the Rhine River Valley. So it's kind of German wine country. It's Riesling country out here, but we're kind of right between Frankfurt and Stuttgart, and then also the French border, kind of the corner of France that juts over into Germany there, the contested area.
Yeah.
Historically.
And then you'll see towards the bottom of the map here some stars. I've visited, various locations all around. I've been in Colmar before, France. Spent a little bit of time in the Black Forest region. I've never visited Heidelberg. What do you like about living in Heidelberg?
It's beautiful. It's one of the most visited places in Germany, actually, where it's kind of just this little small city, about 130,000 people, an old university town. It's actually the oldest university in Germany. I think it was established in the 1300s, sometime in there. And yeah, it's just this kind of university town that's tucked into the edge of kind of a bunch of forests on one side, and then the more kind of busier, more trafficked cities, and then the Rhine that kind of passes through Mannheim, which is right next to it. And so it's in a lot of ways at this crossroads on the border area between Germany and France. We can get to Paris in a few hours. We can get to Berlin in 5 hours. Get to Switzerland in the same 2-3 hours. And so it's situated really well, but it just kind of feels small, where I can also, easily go hiking and mountain biking and things.
Right. Yeah.
Right around here. Yeah, yeah.
And you're obviously doing stuff, in the Netherlands. And so are you having to jump on the train and make your way over to the Netherlands, fairly frequently?
Yeah. About every 2 months. I'm actually going to the Netherlands tomorrow.
Oh, okay.
Every 2 months I go there for a few days, and I've got a group of people I work with who we usually try to schedule different workshops, things like that we're doing together when I'm able to be in person. A few other people are also remote like that.
And you said Eindhoven, right?
Eindhoven, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So if we zoom in, for those of you who are watching this here on YouTube, you can see that we're zooming in on the centrum area here of Eindhoven, and we've got the famous ring road that goes around Eindhoven there. And for anybody who has visited Eindhoven, I'm sure you have checked out the Hoven Ring. The Hoven Ring.
I was going to say, your audience, that's probably what they're going to know from Eindhoven is the Hoven Ring.
Yeah, the Hoven Ring. And what's amazing too is that on Google Maps, when you turn on the bicycle map thing, you just see this like sea of green. There's green everywhere for cycle routes and all that. That is fascinating. So you're working on your PhD.
Right.
Through the Technical University of Eindhoven, is that correct?
That's right, yep.
Yeah, TU Eindhoven.
I have about a year left. Hoping to finish and submit by the end of the year.
Talk a little bit about what it is you're actually studying and what you plan on doing with that pilot higher and deeper degree.
Yeah. So I'm kind of looking at this intersection between history of technology on one side, with the technology being the bicycle, and then mobilities. And so looking at sort of a social history of how people used bicycles over time, looking back, about 130 years is kind of the point that I'm at. So going back to the 1890s, really when bicycles started to appear in any sort of large numbers in cities. But yeah, you're trying to understand kind of how people used bicycles, what sort of social status that conveyed, kind of how they interacted with other mobility options that were available to people at the time, to understand in different cities kind of how we've gotten to where we are in a planning sense, in the sense of just, people biking in cities. And so I focused on Minneapolis as a US city, which the group that I work with, this is their first example from North America even. And so, a lot of times when I mostly present to European audiences. And so I always have to start with a convincing, like, why should we study an American cycling city? I go to Amsterdam and say, here's why we should talk about Minneapolis. And I get a lot of blank stares at first. But what's really interesting to me is all the cities around the world that other researchers in our group are looking at. There are obviously differences and things about it that are novel, but they kind of follow this very similar hierarchy and trajectory of bicycles arriving in cities, being used, and then just kind of the point of how they got to where they are today and how they differentiate based on city. And so actually, if you pull up the graph, that's kind of a good place to start with the images here. I can explain a little bit. Because the overall goal for the research is to kind of have all of these different case studies of different cities, but then to be able to use policy work, the work of bicycle planners, of advocates. And so what this graph is it doesn't include Minneapolis because I'm still hoping to publish this year, the Minneapolis book and volume. But this is a study of cities across Europe, and then one for Johannesburg, which is kind of the dark red one. And this is the modal share of cycling to the best that they can actually identify over time. So this one starts in the early 1900s. And what you see that's really common, and that I see in Minneapolis as well, is this rise in cycling followed by a really steep fall, the stabilization that happens after World War II, and kind of slower but kind of clawing back at trying to get those numbers up. And so it's something that I see in one U.S. city that I've looked at, but that Johannesburg, which I guess I can say for that one, it starts on this graph looking like it's just very high and goes down. But if you look at some of the additional data we found earlier than this, even getting back to the 1890s, it still kind of has this rise that happens before it. And so the question is, across all these cities, cycling plays just a very different role in how people move around today. And anyone who's traveled through the Netherlands or through Denmark or through continental Europe or anyone else can kind of see these differences. And so it's striking to see how the trajectories and the patterns across cities, even globally, that they follow a similar pattern. And that's kind of the starting off point that I work with. What counts like that don't register are people who are riding public transit at the time in the form of streetcars, and then people who are walking, which is, I think, still a big blind spot that people working on transportation and planning issues in cities that they still have, is kind of how to count and understand the role that walking plays in cities.
Yeah. What I find fascinating about this chart is, obviously there was a huge shift in technology. So we're talking about mobility technologies here, and the bicycle, basically came on the scene, a few decades, prior to, I'm thinking of more the modern looking bicycle, not the original.
Yeah. It's kind of that shift from like the penny farthing looking one with the two different size wheels to a bike that looks very familiar to today.
Yes, yeah. The bike that became very familiar to us today, the technical name at the time was the safety bicycle. And it came onto the scene, basically at the turn of the century, and really started to take off and be prominent as a means of transport for the everyday man, as well as workers and doing other types of things. And very soon, the cargo bike came in, because it was really seen as a tool to be able to get places and get things to places. And so you saw that kind of happening. But really what's fascinating is, from a technology perspective, you really see that inflection point where it's just, the rates just drop off like a cliff. And you could totally see that, from the 1940s, post-World War II on, there's just this steep, steep slide that happens. And then, you see areas, like just taking a look at like Copenhagen, number 4 at the top of the chart there, and you see that slide. They also experience that massive slide. But then you also see, beginning in the 1970s, this kind of steady climb back up to be able to bring the bicycle back to where it is now, which is, just like in the Netherlands, it's, a substantial percentage mode share is by bicycle, with sort of an even split between the bicycle and transit and then the private automobile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those inflection points are kind of the first starting point for, I was going to say historians, but I think anyone looking at this chart, you think when it started rising, when it leveled off, and when it starts going down, like what happened there, and why did that happen? And like I said, Minneapolis isn't here, but you see a similar pattern. I'd say the peak is a bit earlier, kind of the early 1900s. It doesn't rise as high, which is another question that I started with, but it really does follow that same rise, fall, stabilization, and then regrowth and recovery. Yeah, but one thing I would actually add is that we've all seen those, I think, really interesting pictures of places like Amsterdam in the 1960s probably, where they're just filled with parking lots, there are cars everywhere, all that kind of stuff. The question, and it's always framed as, Amsterdam wasn't always Amsterdam. But I think it's important to realize that even when Amsterdam wasn't Amsterdam, they still had a modal split of 10 to 20%. And so you've gotten these kind of hidden levels of cycling that don't appear as easily, but that they're still there.
Well, in the story, and the relationship to the bicycle in the Netherlands is a very, very interesting one. And yes, we had the modernization of the cities and the car being seen as modern and appropriate for the future. And then that's where you see that, post-World War II, pre-World War II sort of inflection point there. But it's an oversimplification to say that, this causes that and et cetera. But really the fascinating thing was, even like during the German occupation of the Netherlands, they, kind of like went out of their way to like break the spirit of the Dutch by taking the bikes away. And it's like, kind of hamstringing them. And so there is that certain love to it. And certainly we saw in that, in that chart that, many, many, many people were used to getting around, through that mechanism and, through that mode. And so, it is kind of like taking your mobility away. Because if you're, used to getting around, you look at some of the cities like, Eindhoven right in the middle there of number 12. I mean, you're looking at, 75%, 73% of people are getting around by that, pre-World War II. And it's like, oh, by the way, you're not going to be able to do that anymore during the war period. There's a lot that's tied to that. But yeah, it is interesting too, because your point is very well taken in the sense that, even when you saw that slide of traffic, being, or I should say the slide in modal share via bikes, but at the same time, the cars sort of invading the space that took place, during the post-World War II frame, they still had modal shares that would be the envy of any North American city.
Yeah. The kind of friction you can imagine when streets and cities in the Netherlands were really reimagined and rebuilt to accommodate all these new cars that are there. And you don't see much infrastructure for bikes. A lot of times it's hard to find. Sometimes it's hard to find cyclists. Sometimes, I don't know, some images it's not. There are some really great ones of new highways that are constructed with no cars on them, but that there are just hordes of bicyclists on the side of it, where you can see them being kind of marginalized to the edge like that.
Yeah. And I think that is part of the story too, is that in the Netherlands, the cycle paths, the red cycle paths and all of this was really a manifestation of the post-World War, or excuse me, the post-1970s sort of conflicts that were taking place, and the desire to start, creating some. And so you saw the first couple of segregated paths that were being built specifically to be able to create a network in Delft and in Tilburg and other locations, and then starting to establish that concept of, if we build, this network, we can, start to shift away from that conflict, which really boiled up in the 1970s, over Stop to Kindermord and other types of movements that were happening during that period of time.
Yeah, and you kind of also have to look at I don't know, the two different historical points of building cycle paths and dedicated cycle or bicycle infrastructure in the Netherlands, because they were building bike lanes in the 1920s and the 1930s also. And at the time, the people who were actually cycling were very resistant to being pushed to the edge like that. And when you look at planning documents, it's a lot of getting cyclists out of the way of this inevitable future of cars. And so I think there's that perspective, but then there's our modern perspective of cycling being something, or bicycle infrastructure being something that is going to elevate cycling and get more people actually riding. And so you kind of have some conflict between how it was used in different points in history, and how sometimes comparing those, we can kind of misconstrue a cause and effect.
And there's also a sort of a conflating of different environments too, whether we're talking an Amsterdam urban environment, or whether we're talking a cycle path that exists along a canal getting from one village to another in more of a rural environment. So
Totally.
there's many different things.
Yeah, well, this is actually a good transition for it, because I think one thing that you need as a next step with all of that actual data is a better understanding of who it is who's actually riding bikes in cities at different points in time. And, and in everything that we've seen from cities we've studied is that different cities kind of have a different gap that bicycles come to fill for people's utility. And so in places like the Netherlands, where, a lot of the people who are biking were going from home to industrial work work in factories, really because it was too far to walk, and the public transit service was either not good enough or it was too expensive. And so bicycles become this way to circumvent that. And I compare that to what I found in Minneapolis. The picture you've got on here is an ice salesman during World War II, but it kind of solidifies her in this small subset of workers where it's 100% utility, but it's people whose jobs kind of require them to navigate streets for their jobs. And you see far less of this, traditional home to working in factories kind of commuting, and rather, some of the pictures we have on here are of early bicycle messengers and of early police officers and tradesmen and things like that, where people are navigating streets for their jobs. And it's something that really continues even when it's hard to find a lot of other evidence of cycling in the city.
Yeah. So, and this is a photo, an image from Minneapolis during that time.
Yep. This is 1946.
Now, how did you... Oh, so immediately post-World War II, 1946. Okay.
Yeah, tail end, yeah.
Yeah, the tail end, yeah. My home right here, built in 1946. There you go. Why Minneapolis? When you thought of, okay, I'm going to study a city, what was the reason that you were like, okay, spin the globe and boom, Minneapolis?
Yeah. I think I started with wanting to have just kind of a U.S. city example that would compare to what we've seen in Europe. And I think where Minneapolis is nice is that it in some ways is this very exceptional example, but then in other ways is a very typical, I think, American city and layout, how it develops spatially over time. And so I think a combination of that and just the fact that Minneapolis really persistently since around 2000 or so has been this great American cycling city. I think that there's probably a lot of debate over whether it takes the top spot or not. Lots of cities contending for it. But Minneapolis is consistently in there. It has this amazing trail network that I think few, if any, other cities can actually really compete with on that level. And those trails are actually the same trails that were built by early cyclists at the turn of the 19th century. And so it has this great story of early trail building, early kind of before we transitioned into utility cycling in streets, but early infrastructure that was in a lot of ways just resuscitated in the 1970s and has become a backbone of cycling in the city.
Can I give you my take as to why I think that was a brilliant move as a city to
Sure,
choose?
sure.
Because, one might say, oh, okay, well, if you're going to do this, you're probably going to go with like a New York or, a Davis or something like that, and or even Los Angeles for that matter. But I think it's a brilliant move because it doesn't fall into that quote unquote narrative of, oh, that's like a coastal elite city. This is like a Midwest, upper Midwest, it's like, oh gee, they have winter there and yet they still cycle all year round. And so you kind of push to the side, that immediate gut reaction of nobody rides bikes in winter, blah, 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 etc. So that's why I think it's a brilliant thing, you kind of, push to aside that narrative. Oh, well, that's just a coastal elite place, blah, blah, blah. So.
Yeah. No, I think that's totally part of it. And we would like to see this project turn into a larger research that includes many more American cities. Because in the same way, Minneapolis is one story, and I think to get a better picture, you'd have to bring a lot in there. But I do agree that Minneapolis is a good starting point because of its uniqueness, but then also really just because of what you said, that it's something that people can, I think, more widely attach themselves to.
Yeah. Fantastic. Okay, let's slide on over and take a look at this next image. So this next image is from 1985, still there in Minneapolis.
Yeah. So a lot of the pictures in the narrative of the people who are bicycling in the city, really going from the 1900s until today, are it kind of shows this friction between people who are cycling really as a choice, who are biking as sort of a lifestyle choice and an expression, and then the people for whom the bicycle is kind of their main option for mobility, depending on the system that they're in. That early in the 20th century, it's a transportation system, a mobility system that where walking and public transit were the top in the form of streetcars and buses. And what we see now are, in a post-highway city and country, that automobility is at the top of that, but that bicycles are persistently this, just a way of moving around for people who don't have great other options for moving in cities. And that a lot of times is a conflict with the type of cycling that we as bicycle planners, as advocates, as things like that we're contending with, these competition over what type of cycling it is that we're trying to prioritize.
And here's kind of the example that you gave earlier, which is like the messenger side. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this one's 1920, and again, it's the people at the time who their job was to navigate streets. This kid here, I don't know how old he is, too young to be working, too young that he should have been working. But it's people whose job required them to navigate streets, and so walking, riding streetcars, that doesn't make sense for that group.
Yeah. What's interesting too about Minneapolis as a case example is that part of what sets Minneapolis aside as one of the most bike-friendly cities in North America is a vast network of off-street pathways that link up all the lakes throughout the city. It's one of the backbones of the city, and arguably similar to like Boulder, Colorado, it's really their secret sauce. It's like it's the thing that really sets the stage for active mobility, is that network of pathways. The pros and cons to that are that, sometimes it kind of feels like it's mostly a recreational sort of approach. And their weakness, just like in Boulder's weakness, is that their on-street network of protected all ages and abilities facilities is kind of lacking. But what's really I found fascinating, and I don't know if you found this in your research as well, is that many of those pathways were established early on in the founding of the city. So there was like a foresight of making sure that space around those lakes were preserved as public access and weren't privatized and sold off as being lakefront properties, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. If you could go to, there's a map from 1899 that I've got in the photos here, and it shows exactly that. Because you're right, there was this nationwide movement in the U.S. for what wheelmen, the early cyclists at the time, what they called side paths, because they were paths on the side of muddy carriageways or the side of rivers, of streams, of lakes. This is a time before there was much of a road network, or at least one that you could depend on. And so this map from 1899 shows all of these cycling routes in the Twin Cities. And so at the time of this, there were 200 miles of side paths across the Twin Cities. Yeah, you can zoom in here, and each one of them has kind of concentric circles. And each circle represents a 1 mile radius from downtown. And so it's one of my favorite maps I found, just because it has so much great information in there. The red numbering on there shows how they graded the quality of the paths, or the type of paths, the steepness, that kind of thing. And you can see the density of this network. This is something that building side paths was not unique to Minneapolis or to the Twin Cities. But what was unique is them coming under government control, that they were that a lot of the funding came from these early cyclists, these early wheelmen who paid like an annual fee for their bike tags. But the city itself, in a centralized way, collected that, constructed them, and so they actually held on to the ownership of those side paths as public property. That's something that's pretty unique to Minnesota and to Wisconsin. And so what it means is, even when the side paths went away, they turned into walking paths or horse paths or parkland or whatever, that they weren't privatized, they weren't sold away. So the 1970s come along and everyone's interested in cycling again, and bam, they can take this land and it's easy to just repave it. And they've got this network, and they've added on to it since then, kind of made urban versions of trails. But they've got this backbone to start with. That's a really unique point for Minneapolis and kind of the upper Northwest.
Fascinating stuff. And yeah, you can actually see some of the red circles around some of those lakes right in that area there too. So you can see that. Yeah, that's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, a lot of it was just kind of these wealthy cyclists who lived in the cities, because that's where you lived, and they wanted to find ways to get out to the lakes for recreation.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting too, because when we look at and the other famous path that I want to address, of course, is the Midtown Greenway. And that's represented here. This is in the year 2000. So, gosh, 25 years ago, quarter century ago.
I know. Makes me feel old when I have to count back to 2000. That I don't think is that long ago. But
and this, of course, was an abandoned railway corridor that was one of. And again, if we were to look at the off-street network of paths that Minneapolis has, this is one of the crown jewels that it has. It's an absolutely beloved activity asset in the city, but it's also a critical connector, because it gives you the opportunity to drop down here, zip on through, get to a meaningful destination, jump on up, and get to your different locations. The other great thing now is that we see TOD developments happening along this corridor, and I mean the other TOD, not transit-oriented development. I mean trail-oriented development.
Yeah.
Where you see really cool things happening because people want to be set up, they want to live next to, or they want their business next to this amazing activity asset.
Yeah. There's, I think, just a lot of layers to that story and to the image right here. That, the Midtown Greenway, I mean, that's something that people around the country, anyone who's interested in biking, you think of the Twin Cities and Minneapolis, you think of the Midtown Greenway, that it's this connector between an already pretty robust and dense network of trails, but it allows you to move, to navigate a around and between highways without having to cross at street level very many times, that it's this kind of magical connector. But at the same time, I think that your point about spurring development is another one of those kind of double-edged swords, that it's great to have more dense development along these trails and byways and things, but I think it also opens up the idea of bicycle infrastructure as a bigger part of transportation infrastructure, as kind of going along with displacement. There's a long history in the US of infrastructure being something that, caused is a hard word, but being correlated to that. And when you read newspaper accounts at the time, as well as since 2000, that's a lot of the connection that you have from neighborhood newspapers. And I think that photo there, that also kind of shows some of those frictions of the people who are cycling.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the things that we obviously deal with when we talk about gentrification, and we sort of conflate enhancements to investments in communities and enhancements to the public realm as causing displacement, because that's what happens with the word gentrification, is it gets conflated with displacement, because every city needs to continually invest in every neighborhood needs to continue to invest in itself and not allow itself to just disintegrate through entropy into disarray. That's not what we want. We want investment in the area. We want to gentrify, and we want to be able to do that, but we don't want to necessarily have displacement of people who would prefer to stay in place. And so that's one of the tensions that obviously exists, because we don't need to have that tagline of bike lanes are white lanes and stuff like that, where it's driving people out. That's not the point. Is we want to be able to have the investment in a community. And this isn't unique to active mobility and bikes. I mean, this is technology again. It's one of the challenges that we have and the tensions.
Yeah, there's some interesting historical parallels that I've found specifically between Minneapolis and Rotterdam, which is one of the cities that I do a lot of comparison between. Starting in Minneapolis, that in this period of 2000 until about 2015, you see the modal share of cycling increasing dramatically, and that's the same period where they're building a lot of this infrastructure. The Midtown Greenway is kind of a early piece of that, but a lot of bike lanes and then protected bike lanes, and you see that reflected in more people cycling. But around 2015, they keep building that, but the number of people, at least as a mode share, kind of flattens out. Up and down a little bit per year, but for the most part, it really stays about that level. And what's interesting is that the same thing happened in Rotterdam in the kind of late in the 1990s, where they had to have a realization that they were building infrastructure, but at some point it stopped really getting more people to actually ride bikes. And so they shift their strategy, where they start kind of doing more of a circular method, where it's building the idea of cycling through ways other than infrastructure to get more people on bikes. And then the next, semicircle of that is building infrastructure to support that. So kind of the idea that you're continually building infrastructure for the people who are already biking. And so you have to have both sides of that. And so, I agree that the answer isn't to just not build things and not improve things, but just to recognize the limited nature of infrastructure itself. Because I think it's something that, as planners and engineers, it's really easy to fall back on this idea that, that if you build it, they will come. I think that's something that I attach myself to working in the field, and I'm much more wary of that now.
Well, as I try to, this is part of my keynote presentation that I deliver on Active Towns when I talk about creating a culture of activity within communities, is you absolutely have to build it, meaning the infrastructure, but building it is not enough. It's like, yes, build it and they will come, and the they is a certain portion of the population that's already primed and ready and waiting for that. But I equate it to what I call the hardware and the software partnership of where the hardware is the infrastructure, but you have to back that up with the software, which is all of the other programs and initiatives and awareness campaigns that activate the space and bring it into existence as well. So that's all part of that. Now, this is a photo from 1901 in Minneapolis, and it really is I love this photo. I mean, this is like the photo. This is the photo that goes along with my mug of "Streets Are for People," and this is what I'm talking about. Is that before we allowed the automobile to completely overrun our public realm, our streets were for people, and that's what's beautifully identified here. Now, if I hadn't said that this was Minneapolis, and I just said that this is just a city, it could have easily been a Rotterdam, because until World War II, Rotterdam was completely obliterated and bombed and destroyed by the Germans during that period of time. And then when it rebuilt under a modernist sort of car first initiative. And to your point that you just made earlier of a few decades later, there was that inflection point of realizing that, what we were doing was not the wisest thing, because we have this sort of dead environment of car-centric design, and they have been, over the most recent decades, been on a mission to reverse the damage that they caused by building, under modernity of drive everywhere for everything. But walk us through this series of images from Minneapolis, because this is core to the research that you're doing.
Yeah. So this is downtown Minneapolis, 1901. We kind of talked about this time period when cycling was transitioning from the wheelmen going out on sojourns to the lakes to early workers who were using bikes to get around. And this is really exactly that point in time when you start to see bikes not just used on side paths and on trails and in nature, but in the city for utility. And what I would also call, actually, just a second for the other one, what I would also call attention to is that it's not just that this is pre-car, but this a lot of ways is a very different kind of definition of what a street is and what it's used for. That people are obviously walking and traveling on it, but it's less of this moving people from A to B. And it's something that was used as a public space as much as it was for transportation and mobility. And so you see people walking, crossing wherever they want to. This is before traffic engineering and urban planning had developed as professions. And so it's a point in time where streets are public places as much as they are actual transportation.
In other words, they really were for people.
Yeah. There's a whole history of parents sending their kids to go play in the street. In a lot of ways, like playgrounds were developed because kids got kicked out of streets.
And I don't want to paint this with too much of a brush of this being like all wonderful and perfect and blah, blah, blah. I mean, most of these streets, for the most part, were unpaved in many cases. Many of them had horse shit all over them, and that would get pulverized and turned into like a pollution. And so, yeah, we get it. It wasn't. We're not saying that this is like Shangri-La and perfect, but it was. To your point, these were where you would run into people, and you would, you'd be able to come together en masse, and this is kind of cool. What's really interesting too is that it's obviously removed by many, many decades, but the image that we see here from 1985 on Nicollet is very similar in the sense that we've got just a mass of humanity in the street.
Yeah. I think that, the 1980s were right after the highway construction, urban renewal, white flight, a lot of the industrial and jobs flight out of the city. And so in a lot of ways, you start seeing these, bicycles as just utility for people getting around. You get some of the cycling cultures that I think of as being very, very American, of people who are using bikes kind of on their own in the cities in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of this, reclamation of streets and mobilities very separate from how experts intend any of that to actually work. And a lot of them are kind of pushed to the side where they can do their own thing. But
What's funny too is I think it was in 2013, I attended an Open Streets event in Minneapolis. I don't think it was on Nicolette, but it could have been. And this reminds me of that Open Streets event where, it was like the cars shut down or the streets are shut down, the cars, and people are able to come out and, convene and rollerblade and ride bikes or just, occupy the space.
Yeah. I think the open space is a really cool alternative to the like very strictly organized structure that you see, coming historically out of places like the Netherlands and Denmark. This picture here, this is, this one was 1907, I think. And what you see is the same like technology change of the streets, how people are using streets. You see the bicycle, you see the car, you see the streetcar, you see a horse-drawn carriage. You still see a woman just walking through the middle of the street. And so it's kind of this intermediate period where streets really were still public places, but you had vehicles and drivers who wanted to go quickly on them, who were trying to figure out how you kind of how do you put a new technology into into an older type of mobility structure in the city.
And thereby we start to see that tension starting to come up. You've got the interloper, the new technology that has an internal combustion engine and can, move along at a pretty brisk pace, and not be constrained by a railroad track line, and can go anywhere. And
One of the most interesting findings, I think, especially for my European colleagues and kind of comparing Minneapolis to other European cities we've looked at, is that I feel like during this time period, a lot of the reason that cycling didn't develop as high of numbers and usage as European cities is actually because public transit was so good and the city was so walkable. That it's a city that was built around milling. I mean, that's right downtown was the old lumber and then grain mills. And the people who lived there lived within a mile or two. And so they could easily walk to work. They didn't have use for bicycles for that type of commuting. And then the streetcar, how that was organized, was basically as a sort of public monopoly where there were private companies, but that they had to get local city permission for any sort of rate changes. They were responsible for maintaining the streets and rights of way they used. And so they remained artificially affordable really up until World War II. And that's something that, you kind of see, at least what I've seen in Minneapolis is lower class workers who are walking mostly, and then the middle class who are mostly riding streetcars. And so the gap that's left for bicycles is this kind of small subset of workers. And that's something that really endures through and until highway construction, or until today. But you see the break after highway construction of a city that's moving from a walking and public transit city to one that's really built and defined around cars.
Right, yeah. And this brings us to 1923. So yeah, we
1923.
See that evolution.
Yeah, exactly. All three of them, I don't know if I said before, but they're all the same street, not the same location. They're all Nicollet Avenue. And here you start to see that organization based around cars put into play. There's no car infrastructure added. You have the policeman who's doing the stop and go, but you see what's more familiar with us today. If cars parked on the side, the driving on the right side, it's when they start kind of organizing how to make left turns at intersections. So before they rebuilt the streets, they had to kind of redefine what a street is and how it should function. And I would direct anyone interested in this transition to the work of Peter Norton. I'm not sure if you've had him on your podcast before, but he's written 3 times. Okay. Yeah. Amazing. But he writes in a lot of detail about how this change happened socially before it did physically. And you can kind of see this on streets, especially during the 1920s and 1930s, that this organization happens and which read newspapers, they have to convince people of it. They have to sell it in the same way that planners and engineers tried to sell highways to people. And that people resisted this. They resisted this. And you can see on the edges of this picture that, sidewalks that have just hundreds and hundreds of people crammed into them, that I think, you first look at a picture like this and you think, oh, cars came to the city. This is the beginning. But there are many, many, many more people on this street than there are cars and drivers. They're just pushed to the side.
They're pushed to the side, as well as clustering to try to get across the street as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Asking permission. Can I please come get across? Can I please? and another shot of somebody using a bike for work.
Police officer.
Yeah, back to 1905 as
well. Yep, policeman, 1905. And you start to see these groups, the people who are, whose job requires them to navigate streets, that they ride bikes. They eventually start getting either adding motors onto their bikes or buying motorcycles. But it's this really specific use case that is a small subset, but it's something that endures for a long time.
Right. So you're working on this PhD and you're doing this study. You say you've got about a year or so left to this process. What's the end result? What's going to be produced from this work?
So the piece of it that I'm actually working on mostly right now is a comparison between Minneapolis, Rotterdam, and Johannesburg. And so I'm comparing based on some of the themes that come out of those cities. So the one that I'm currently working on is focused around mobility alternatives. So understanding, during different points of time, the different kind of mobility hierarchies that existed in cities, what place bicycles served in those, how that changed over time, and then how those histories kind of define the roles that the different modes have in the cities today, with the idea that this longer historical approach, I think, can benefit people who are working in planning policy work, to do a comparison that's not just based on the infrastructure in different global cities, but the process that it took to actually get to that.
And I'm going to pop on over to your LinkedIn page. Folks, you can find Peter out on LinkedIn, and here he is. And this is the post for Cycling Cities, the Minneapolis experience. Walk everybody through what this is all about.
Yeah. So for each city that we're doing is case studies. Like I said, Minneapolis is our first from North America. We publish those as books that are 50, 60 pages. They're not big books or anything, but they're very richly illustrated with photographs, with maps, with newspaper and archival research to kind of tell the story or the experience, if you will, of cycling in that city. And so they all fit into to the global cycling cities program. But each one of them kind of enriches that story. And especially with Minneapolis, we hope that this is a jumping off point into being able to do similar projects for 10 to 12 American or North American cities to kind of understand what those have to tell. And thank you for bringing this up here. I'm doing a crowdfunding campaign to help us be able to publish this. And so anyone who's interested, I would really encourage you to donate what you're able to on here. And you can also secure early copies of the book. You can help us to print additional copies that we can donate into schools, into libraries locally, initially in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities, and then branching out from there. But it's something that helps us to, one, get the story out there, get it in more hands, and then two, be able to build this into a larger project that I think the more city experiences we're able to do and then to connect together, the richer that becomes, and the more we're able to actually guide policy today based on deeper historical understandings of change.
Right. And you can see that you can read more about the actual project, is all that in there. Why it matters, understanding the American context in this. And like you said just there, is the whole point of doing this is hopefully so that we can pave the way forward, if you'll pardon the pun, to a better future for our cities. And I'll paraphrase something that Professor Dan Pietkowski from Oslo Met University talks about in his book, Cycling City, is really, it's not about creating bike-friendly cities, it's what the bike can actually do for our cities and our livability and our environment. So it's just a tool towards hopefully creating a more livable and desirable and comfortable place.
Yeah. Yeah. I think despite what those of us who love bikes think, there's nothing inherently magical about a bike, but what it offers people, and I think what people are able to do with it, is where that those really powerful stories come in. And that's something that's been happening for over 100 years and hopefully will continue to happen in a more prominent position for years to come.
Yeah, yeah. Is there anything that we haven't covered yet that you want to make sure that we leave the audience with?
I think maybe one thing that we haven't covered would be to think about and understand kind of the different approaches that cities around the world have taken to prioritizing cycling. That I think that in planning, we focus a lot on the very Northern European approach that segments different users into different groups. But I think what we're starting to see is, things coming out of Paris and Barcelona and South America and Japanese style of organizing streets. There are lots of different ways to approach mobility in cities, and infrastructure is one lens to see that through. But that all of the decisions that you see on streets, you see in policies, that you see in how people use technologies, that's something that there are cycles of intentionality that built that, and that we can continue to do that ourselves and learn from each other.
So from some of those cities that you just named off, are there any that, or areas, the cities and or areas, are there any that really, bubble up for you as an example of, well, this is a really important, different way of approaching this compared to what the typical North American, the typical Northern European approach?
Yeah. I think that something like the Bogota model is a really interesting one for Americans to look at, because it's something that, like we talked about, focuses around open streets, where it's not, eventually it builds infrastructure for it, but a lot of ways it's providing this space for people to experience a new way of moving around in a way that's not connected to work or kind of the stressful travel, but it's something that on Sundays and on weekends, they just open streets up and tell people to move around how you want to and experience something different. And I think that's a way to bring people into biking and to walking and to rollerblading and whatever else you want to do in a low stress kind of way, that it kind of eases that transition and how people choose to move around. And then that's something you can build from, that it kind of builds a culture of cycling and walking in cities.
Sure. Yeah. And culture is an interesting thing to look at. I mean, it's one of the areas that I spend a lot of time in. My background is in behavior change and creating cultures of activity, and it's always interesting when you see the different permutations and see different environments sort of developing into a different culture and approach to it. So you mentioned Japan. So you take a look at a place like Japan, where the cultural norms of mobility and independence with children and being able to get around their communities, and a completely different approach to streetscapes. Is that like an example, or are you like digging in and looking at the differences between like a Tokyo approach to streets and how it encourages active mobility?
I would be interested in doing that. I'm not doing that right now, but I think Japan represents a place that's, from someone who doesn't know very much about cycling in Japan, actually, but that has been successful in a lot of ways at elevating cycling and doing that on streets that look very different than how we in Europe and in North America have done that. I think that I saw recently that Velocity announced their 2027 conference, maybe, that's taking place in Japan.
Oh, okay. I didn't notice that. That's fabulous.
It's one of the provinces that has, I think, something like 25% mode share, where it's kind of similar levels to these great European cities, but it's just a big blind spot, I think, within advocacy and in planning. And so maybe the takeaway for me is just that having a broader understanding of what cycling does and can look like in other places can give you more things in your toolbox.
Yeah. and really different approaches at that and all that. You mentioned Paris, and I really see Paris as more of the same sort of North American and Northern European approach, just on steroids, in terms of the fact that they're just implementing quickly, and it, to me, it's a really strong message that the mayor is sending, a really strong message that hey, we know we have a problem, we've got a problem. I was there for the very first car-free day that she did in 2015 to document that first Sunday, car-free streets day. And the quote in the newspapers leading up to that day is, hey, we've got a problem when you can't even see the Eiffel Tower through the smog. And so she knows that we have to do this, and then she has, for more or less, a mandate to move forward by the voters, who continue to vote her back into office. And then even this week, earlier this week or last week, it's early this week, it's Monday, last week, the voters over the weekend went to the polls and approved a whole bunch more Streets Are for People initiatives. So the Paris voters are voting at the ballot box to improve the quality of life. And so I really see that as not necessarily fundamentally different than what's happening in North America and Northern Europe, as much as it's just really on overdrive, really moving fast.
Yeah. I think that's probably a fair assessment. I think that it's happening much faster than we typically see, and there's a strong just environmental, really air quality motivation for doing that. Kind of a combination of dedicated bicycle infrastructure, but then also limiting cars and driving in different ways, either on streets or based on kind of license plate numbers entering the city, all that kind of stuff.
Yes, yeah, very analogous. Yeah, and school streets, the school streets initiatives that they're doing there too. So yeah. One thing I actually see a lot of in Germany, which I wouldn't say this is a great departure, but it's taking streets that have bike lanes and actually just converting them to adhere, called Fahrradstraßen, or like bike streets. And so they're removing the dedicated infrastructure and essentially just using traffic calming to achieve the same thing. And so I think that's something that we're seeing more of. And we're seeing that in cities like in Utrecht, but their general rule of thumb is that they usually don't make that transition away from protected and segregated infrastructure to a fietsstraat there in the Netherlands, bicycle priority street, unless the number of cyclists are outnumbering the drivers 8-1. And then they're like, okay, then this makes sense because this is the primary user of this, and actually what we need is more space because the cycle lanes are too crowded. Yeah, I think that I didn't know those specifics in the Netherlands, but I think that is a good lesson to have. Yeah. yeah, exactly. That traditionally the bike lanes are kind of moving people out to the edges, and when you really want to prioritize them on a street that can handle it, give them the street and get everyone going that speed. Exactly, give them the street and move on. Peter, this has been so much fun. Now, we could nerd out forever, but I know I need to let you go, and I know you've got travel plans coming up later this week. Again, Peter, thank you so very much. Best of luck on your studies and on the fundraising for the book Cycling Cities. Folks, be sure to check out the link. I'll put it down below in the show notes and in the video description below. Again, Peter Bird, thank you so much for joining me on the Active Towns podcast. Perfect. Thank you too. Have a good day. Hey, thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode with Peter Bird. And if you did, please, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, and share it with a friend. And if you haven't done so already, be honored to have you subscribe to the channel. Just click on the subscription button down below and be sure to ring that notifications bell. And again, if you're enjoying this content here on the Active Towns channel and are finding it valuable and interesting, please consider supporting my efforts by becoming an Active Towns ambassador. Super easy to do. Again, just navigate over to activetowns.org, click on that support tab at the top of the page, and there's several different options, including becoming a Patreon supporter. Patrons do get early and ad-free access to all my content. Again, thank you all so much for tuning in. I really do appreciate it. And until next time, this is John signing off by wishing you much activity, health, and happiness. Cheers. And again, just want to send a huge thank you to all my Active Towns ambassadors supporting the channel financially via YouTube memberships, YouTube super thanks, as well as making contributions to the nonprofit and joining my Patreon. Every little bit adds up and is very much appreciated. Thank you all so much.